I also think that for scholars, you know, throughout their PhD and then later on into the academic fields, aren't necessarily going to do something so different because it's so tempting to find what you're dealing with your, I'm going to call them the major texts, maybe the central text of the book or article. And it's so tempting to, when you get something like ECCO, find those lesser studied texts that help you make your point or fit so well because you can search through them to make that case that you think is brand new or needs to be said about what's going on. But again, it's an all texts are equal. You're not, unless you're really deep in the history of the book, you're not that interested in print circulation and how much access this pamphlet, that's kind of random because you have been doing searches through ECCO, has in, let's just call it its real world value, what's happening on the ground in the 18th century. You're calling it context. You're maybe more new historicists, so you're not making that distinction, but you are reading them next to each other in the texts are created equally, perhaps, kind of paradigm. The only solutions I see to that are, one, that 15-week semester, if you're on a trimester, 10-week, has to have a lot more instruction and a lot less syllabus orientation to it in terms of these, of getting undergraduates to be much more historical. And we're literary departments. We're at the MLA. Historians have their own organizations. So that level of interdisciplinarity, which it seems to me necessary, is very hard to deal with for practical reasons, as well as literary historians and historians don't always talk nicely to each other. And secondly, at maybe an editor level, at the higher PhD and the professoriate, at where really the only guard is an editor, whether it's for a book or for a journal, who might step in and say, there needs to be, I mean, more, maybe the term is more history of the book in these citations for this article and what's going on. So I just wondered what people were maybe thinking about kind of at the pedagogical level, say, even if considering the editor as a pedagogical figure of some sort, what you all might think of that.
Can I take this one? I think there are a number of points to address in this, and the first point is really, well, when you do a full text search for words, you find the words that you're looking for. And I think methodologically that is a problem because, as you said, you build up a case for your own point of view, but alternative points of view are not recognized, especially if they employ a different vocabulary. Just to use a very basic example, I was doing a search for kitchen gardens. If you didn't know that kitchen could also be spelled C-H-I-N instead of E-N, you would have huge difficulties finding the material you wanted. The second problem, I think, is one of scholarship. What I was talking about in my little paper was this issue of horizontal digressiveness, where you feel the need to kind of link context to context. The problem with this is that with texts which are relatively unfamiliar, you kind of have to take it on faith that they had some sort of historical, representational plenitude, which is another Greenblatt face. And you have to assume that they were somehow historically significant without actually knowing what the circulation might be, what the imprint sizes could be. So I think that is a different problem, and that in some way takes us back to almost a new critical way of looking at a text in its own right, without any sort of like context. So I think methodologically that is an issue. I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, the sort of pedagogical guidance that you're looking for, which I regard as essential for the kind of exercise you've described, is the sort we would expect to put up on Literature Compass. I mean, that's exactly what Literature Compass exists for, to provide a forum for scholars to state what they believe to be the relative importance of all the texts that you can find in a particular period.
I just want to say that, so it seems to me part of what you're talking about is editorial apparatus, which would typically be present in a book form of a given text. And what I find sort of interesting about that is, you know, that's unexciting to do for the most part, and it's exciting to tag, right? And so people want to tag, they want to create their own exhibits and things. They don't want to just get in there and this text was printed in this many copies at this place and circulated here. And you know, that's dull, but that would be really wonderful if that was in ECCO, right? If every text said, here's where it came from, here's how it was printed, here's which version of it, because a lot of them, you know, have you know, every printed version was slightly different or whatever. That would be great, but and maybe it would be nice if there was some scholarly reward for doing that kind of work, which there really isn't at this point.
We have time for one last question. I was just wondering, going back to sort of your original question for everybody about, what can we do with this panel? I was just wondering, who is in charge of ECCO, and like how much say do we have in like the changes that can be made? Because if they have, if they have a monopoly on the supply, we kind of have a monopoly on the demand, and so if if we have with a panel like this, what it does is it kind of brings us all together, and we go, yeah, I have that frustration too. And so, if we have a monopoly on the demand, then maybe we can use these kinds of panels for, changing ECCO in a way that suits our needs. Because it would be nice to. All of us are like, yeah, it would be really nice to have more, contextualization, so we can maybe take this. And how can we change ECCO to suit our needs is my question, and I hope somebody knows this.
And ECCO should be here listening to David Radcliffe's suggestions. I had so many responses over email about this panel from people who are independent scholars who don't have access to even public library facilities, and they seem to be, as a number of you pointed out, a market, and this seems you used the word possible several times, and I assume both technologically and commercially. So how about realistically?
Gail Thompson owns it, and you can email them, and I've emailed them and said, here's my long list of mistakes I found yesterday. Fix them.
Well, it would be, it might be nice if,
We have to clear the room, but one quick thing, and then if Christine wants to make the...
I can just say quickly that your librarian is an excellent resource for sort of aggregating the discontents with these products and bringing them back as the purchasers, not just of this particular product, but of all of Thomson Gale's and ProQuest's other digital databases. We sink more money into these, invest more money into these companies every year, and we are in sort of a bargaining position. There are some things that simply aren't going to be remedied on a time frame that is useful to us, but there are enhancements being made and changes that we can advocate for.
Yeah, it seems like what we're asking for is a subscription-based wiki where like certain people are allowed to add content, and not just like the 19-year-old in Kentucky who's like, well, I know about Swift, so that's what we want to avoid, right? We want to avoid that. But, we also well, I know about it would be really great and would be really useful for everybody if, the scholar was like, well, I know about the production history. I could just, type that out in 5 minutes, And that seems like what we're asking for, some sort of, subscription-based wiki.
Well, thank you all for coming, and let's put this panel to work.